Are you ready?
Yep, we're live.
Hello, everyone. We're coming to you from California. You can see the sun has not set behind us over here. My name's Austin Carter. I'm in San Francisco. I'm the editor-in-chief of Sejour magazine, and Patrick Zapian is going to be lecturing today. He's in LA. We're going to have hopefully some back and forth throughout the conversation with you who are watching. Um, please ask your questions. Is that going to be through YouTube?
Yeah,
Okay, I will have to get in there to see those, and I'll be emceeing and try to relay your questions to Patrick. But we definitely want this to be a conversation, even though it's billed as a lecture. And I'm going to get started by just speaking a little bit about the background of aesthetic theory. This is a posthumously published work by Theodore Adorno, published in 1970. He died in 1969. And the editors presented the book pretty much in the state in which they had it when he died. He'd been working on it off and on for the better part of 10 or 12 years. And it had undergone many revisions. And we can't really treat this as the final version or as the version that Adorno would have wanted us to see and read if he had been able to uh, see it through himself. Um, I'm gonna a little bit of some of his statements about it. Just a few days before he died, he said that the book was still in need of a desperate effort, and basically it is now a matter of organization, and hardly that of the substance of the book. So we can say that um, essentially the material is there, but the presentation is perhaps not as polished as it might have otherwise been. Um, the other side of this coin, I would say, if you feel a little mystified reading aesthetic theory, um, my advice is to read some of Adorno's other essays, especially his notes to literature, where he is working out his aesthetic theory in contact with an object, in contact with a poem or a book, or a body of work, where um, it's more concrete and you're able to, um, I believe, follow it along in a little bit more, with more confidence. But to speak a bit more about the organization of the book, I wanted to quote Adorno. Where is this? The way it will help you read it, I believe. Um, he says, it is interesting that in working on this book, there obtrudes from the content various implications for the form that I long expected, but that now indeed astonish me. It is simply that from my theorem that there is no philosophical first principle. It now also results that one cannot build an argumentative structure that follows the usual progressive succession of steps, but rather that one must assemble the whole out of a series of partial complexes that are, so to speak, of equal weight and concentrically arranged all on the same level. Their constellation, not their succession, must yield the idea. He also says, these difficulties consist in this, that a book's almost ineluctable movement from antecedent to consequence proved so incompatible with the content that for this reason, any organization in the traditional sense, which up until now I have continued to follow, even in negative dialectics, proved impracticable. The book must, so to speak, be written in equally weighted paratactical parts that are arranged around a midpoint that they express through their constellation. And the there was a quotation that Adorno intended to use as the motto for aesthetic theory, which was a statement by Friedrich Schlegel. What is called the philosophy of art usually lacks one or two things, either the philosophy or the art. And before I turn it over to Patrick, I wanted to uh, add one more little statement from Adorno that comes from um, a letter that he wrote to one of his students about how the mediation of conceptual thinking with artistic practice, which is why why this book is of interest to us and I assume to you. How Adorno, as a composer of music himself, the way he thought about the way he thought about conceptually thinking through what he did while he was composing. The question about the legacy of theoretical consciousness in artistic production is indeed central to my own intellectual fate, that is to say, still unresolved. I continue to hope, against all reason, that I will yet be able to realize something of what I thought I could accomplish as an artist, and that competent people also thought I could accomplish, so that I'm not afraid of being caught in the Nero-like qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies with me. This implies, admittedly, that I don't, after all, consider the two to be as incompatible as you suggest. I've had the experience precisely with artists of the highest caliber that lack of reflection and adequate intellectual awareness, often overcompensated for by ad hoc pseudo-theories based on Weltanschauung, today, when there is nothing for them to hold on to, has also affected their own production in the most grievous way. The greatest example of this is Schoenberg, who in the lesser texts of his so-called major works truly raged against himself. However, I'm of the opinion that the reason for the falseness lies in the relationship between the two spheres, in the fact that so many artists are trying to achieve the atrocity of a synthesis of intellectual content and art. In other words, they pump some sort of ideas into the works and mistake that for meaningful content. The relation of the intellect to art can only consist in the intellect, above all, the critical intellect, giving directives as to what is possible and what is not possible. It cannot become the immediate object or content of art. Beckett, and aesthetic theory was also intended to be dedicated to Samuel Beckett. Beckett, a person who embodies truly indescribably advanced consciousness and at the same time maintains a strict distance from all interpretation of his works, and from mine as well, seems exemplary to me in this regard. And I myself forget when I am composing literally everything that I have ever thought about it, without, I hope, forgetting it after all. On to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Austin. Yeah, the last point was great. I think kind of introduction to like why I wanted to put on this lecture or yeah, what motivated the lecture. So some of you may have seen last month we hosted a panel with a few art critics on the crisis of art criticism. We had a panel with representatives from the Manhattan Art Review, Chicago Spleen, and Midwest Art Quarterly. And, we were sort of posing the question to them as, what is the purpose of art criticism? What is the current situation of art criticism? We see sort of these publications we sort of saw these publications kind of emerging in response to like the death of art criticism over the past few years, and in particular the kind of absence of kind of more critical, evaluative criticism. And so, yeah, we hosted a panel last month, bringing these people together, and I thought this lecture would be a good way to kind of offer a response from my perspective as to sort of what the current situation of art requires critically. Because I think while the discussion was good, I do think that there were a lot of the hangups that I think Adorno is sort of gonna sort of yeah, explain to us why there's sort of hangups. Like I do think there's a kind of generally today an emphasis on understanding art from a kind of subjective perspective, whether that's adjudicating things on terms of like the subjectivity of the artist, or whether that's in terms of how the viewer subjectively responds to an artwork. But I think what this kind of leaves out is really the question of like the objectivity of the artwork and what the existence of art as an object kind of means for society and society for the world that we live in. And so yeah, how art is not just a subjective phenomenon, but an objective one as well. And I think Adorno is really concerned with um, getting at that. Um, so he begins. So the lecture, or my lecture, I'm going to try to stick to or talk about the draft introduction that Adorno prepared for aesthetic theory. Because I think it covers most of the main points, and it's pretty. I don't know. Yeah, it's a pretty thorough introduction. But he sort of begins by talking about the kind of um, well, the way that the way that aesthetics seems to not have a clear purpose, or the uncertainty as to the purpose of aesthetics, with in its relationship to the rest of philosophy. Um, so he sort of talks about like the situation of aesthetics in his moment is kind of having basically broken apart into two kind of perspectives. On the one hand, you have this kind of what he calls like a nominalist perspective that he attributes to Crochet, where he thinks that like there's this turn away from the traditional categories and sort of principles of art, the kind of classical categories, and with Crochet, a turn towards the artwork itself and trying to understand um, artwork kind of empirically in terms of like what is going on in each individual artwork. And then on the other side, you have kind of this classicism that is trying to establish abstract general norms for what art is and what it should be. And for Adorno, really the problem is the fact that aesthetics has kind of broken apart into these two different sides of things. For Adorno, it seems like there's that the critique of art has kind of like broken apart into a kind of a critique of like the concepts of art, and then like a kind of practical consideration of what the object is. I've got some quotes that I kind of want to use to work through the lecture a bit, so maybe I'll pull one of the first ones up. Um, is this working? Hmm. Okay, I'm having a little trouble with this, but I'll just get into the Adorno quote. He writes, after the demise of idealistic systems, the difficulty of an aesthetics that would be more than a desperately reanimated branch of philosophy is that of bringing the artist's closeness to the phenomena into conjunction with a conceptual capacity free of any subordinating concept, free of all decreed judgments, committed to the medium of concepts, such an aesthetics would go beyond a mere phenomenology of artworks. On the other hand, the effort, under the pressure of the nominalistic situation, to make a transition to what has been called an empirical aesthetics is in vain. All aesthetic questions terminate in those of the truth content of artworks. Is the spirit that a work objectively bears in its specific form true? For empiricism, this is, as superstition, anathema. For it, artworks are bundles of indeterminate stimuli. What they are in themselves is beyond judgment. Any claim to know is a projection. Only subjective reactions to artworks can be observed, measured, and generalized. As a result, the actual object of aesthetics escapes study. It is replaced by what is at bottom a pre-aesthetic sphere that has proved to be socially that of the culture industry. That empiricism recoils from art, of which in general it has hardly ever taken notice, other than insofar as it attributes all knowledge that does not agree with its rules of the game to be poetry, can be explained by the fact that art constitutively dismisses these rules of the game because art is an entity that is not identical with its imperia. What is essential to art is that which in it is not the case, that which is incommensurable with the empirical measure of all things. The compulsions to aesthetics is the need to think this empirical incommensurability. So for me, I think what was important about this question, sorry, about this quote and the way that Adorno is approaching um, art here is that I mean he's trying to pick up on the way that the experience of an artwork can't really be adjudicated by the kind of things that appear in an artwork empirically. That the value of a painting is not reducible to what one can just see visually, um, or that what a painting is as an artwork is an object that is kind of trying to go beyond what it is materially or visually, and so that that what the actual aesthetic form of the artwork consists of is um, not just like the actual object or the material things that create the artwork. Um, not just what you see, but also how how that's formed and the kind of like history that is congealed in the forms that art uses to create itself. Um,
Yeah, here you also have one of the first formulations of the idea that he circles around a lot. Um, how how I mentioned the way that it was that it's composed around sort of concepts that he circles and reaches to and goes in some direction, and then he returns to an articulation of it from a different angle to cast light on it until it's fully figured. Early in the quote that you said, um, he says the aesthetics, the type of aesthetics that he's hoping to establish here, um, brings the artist's closeness to the phenomena into conjunction with a conceptual capacity free of any subordinating concept, free of all decree judgments, committed to the medium of concepts. So those are really the two primary nodes of the dialectic that he sort of returns to as he meanders in these other directions. But it's experiential, work immanent analysis of the work and conceptuality, where are neither, you can't choose one over the other, and you have to have both and neither at the same time. In the way that he talked about it in that letter of holding these these opposites in your head at once. That's his conception of dialectical thinking.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I wonder how useful it might be to get into, yeah, I guess some of the background for it for Adorno, or like where this is coming from for him. Because I think one thing, I guess, yeah, to take a step back a little bit, I think it's important to think about the way that Adorno is approaching like art in general here, like in aesthetic theory, because he's not approaching art as like this kind of eternal category of like humanity or something like that. Like he has a very specific kind of historical approach to art, and I think yeah, maybe it's good to get a little bit into what that is. Because for Adorno, like the starting point for considering art philosophically isn't to kind of try to derive a kind of like ontological basis for art. For him, it's not about like art as a kind of eternal concept or like some kind of like eternal form of like human spirit or something like that. For him, art is just like something that has appeared through the course of history and has like come into being. And he wants to sort of understand that coming into being. And so that's why he sort of bases the whole of aesthetic theory essentially on Kant and Hegel, and kind of trying to reconsider Kant and Hegel in the 20th century. Because for Adorno, Kant and Hegel are really the representatives of like the emerging consciousness of like art when it sort of first appears as such in like the 18th and 19th century. So Adorno would kind of like understand the kind of like long history of art as kind of being the history of like the gradual sort of development and emergence of art unconsciously for millennia until you kind of reach the 18th century. He would sort of understand that art prior to the 18th century was kind of always bound up with either like magic or religion, or architecture is something that Hegel will also sort of talk about in his lectures on aesthetics. But essentially art, or at least what we understand art now to be, painting, sculpture, music, and poetry, and these kind of discrete forms, they were kind of bound up with these other parts of life. They were kind of part of the unity of life in a way that it was kind of really hard to disentangle. And so, painting was a part of like the architecture of churches, and couldn't really be, or at least at the time wasn't really thought of as being separate from that, and not just separate from the kind of like form of the church architecturally, but from what the church meant spiritually, religiously. And it was at that point kind of like all part of a unity of life. And it's really not until right the 18th century when you have like the emergence, or well, really into the it's with the Renaissance that you have like the beginning of bourgeois society, sort of classically, and that's kind of like the emergence of markets and of a kind of the dissolution of feudalism gradually, by the displacement of being displaced by markets, the emergence of a working class, as opposed to a peasantry, and what you get in this kind of like transformation over the course of the Renaissance to the 18th century is like gradually art ceases to be like a part of ceases to be a part of religious life, ceases to be a part of like the rest of kind of like the cultural sphere. There's the patron system essentially ends there, and the church no longer becomes kind of like the primary supporter of art. And instead artists kind of are now, then become free to sell their work like on the market and kind of just uh, basically produce work on speculation. So prior to the 18th century or prior to the Renaissance, people would artists would really be working on commission basis only, kind of exclusively, and would be working for the church or would be working for a noble kind of directly. But with the Renaissance and with this kind of like, freeing up of society generally, through exchange and through the emergence of markets, artists, lose that kind of patronage and, gain a new kind of freedom in the sense that they're no longer being dictated what their works need to be about or what they should be about. They're able to kind of on their own reflect on what it means to be an artist and what kind of art they would like to make, or even, what it means to make art at all. So in the 18th, in the Renaissance, the 18th century, you have the emergence of like still life, portraiture of landscapes and all of these kind of like genres that are kind of like the sort of first ways in which like art tries to kind of, take hold of its own autonomy. These are the kind of the first forms that artists kind of develop for thinking about art independently of religion or of these other kind of things, thinking about art sort of on its own terms. So that's kind of like the background in a sense, so and
Yeah, I want to open that up a little bit with some, Adorno, especially jumping into this draft introduction, you could say he assumes a lot of background knowledge on our part. And even in some of what you just said, I wanted to ask you to
mhm,
um, put a finer point on some of it. And it gets at where Kant and Hegel, good as in as far as they go, and what are the changed historical conditions that require uh, a new aesthetics that necessitate what he's doing.
mhm,
So could you elaborate on what you mean by bourgeois society and what the crisis of bourgeois society in capitalism means
mhm,
for art? What's the difference between capitalism and bourgeois society, and why are we in a different place than they were?
right. um Yeah, so I mean, the way that Adorno would understand bourgeois society is that it's, the society of labor. Um, and so yeah, so going back to like what I was talking about in terms of like the emergence of markets and commodity exchange in the Renaissance to the 18th century, you also have like as a part of that, the emergence of labor and abstract labor as kind of like the mediating value um, that sort of allows for exchange. And so, Marx kind of famously will talk about like the development of like over time of like a sense of abstract labor time. The it, yeah, that basically things start to be measured in terms of like how much time it would take to produce that thing. Um, because there's a sense of like yeah, a general sense of how much labor is expended over a course of time. And, this is kind of like becomes the general principle of society in general. Everything becomes um, reducible, can be made equivalent to some quantity of labor. Um, and so that's sort of how Adorno would understand like bourgeois society or sort of what is the defining character quality of bourgeois society. It's that labor is the kind of mediating value that defines everything. So like Hegel sort of has this well yeah. So to talk about dialectics, the Hegelian dialectic is that of like spirit and nature. And so Hegel understands that like nature is everything that exists. Um, it's kind of like, yeah, the it's like objectivity, the totality of like existence, of objective existence. And then spirit is something that is a part of nature. It's a part of that objective existence, but it's the kind of conscious part of that, the part that can reflect and think about what that nature is. And so, for Hegel, there's a dialectic of spirit and nature, in that like nature produces spirit, which then is able to consciously reflect on nature, on what exists, and then through that process of reflection, is able to act on nature and transform it. And so that, for that's the kind of the dialectic that sort of Hegel tries to sort of lay out historically in the phenomenology of spirit, and which Adorno in this draft introduction actually kind of like mentions that, the artwork is kind of like the culmination of the master slave dialectic in a certain sense. And, because the master slave dialectic for Hegel was kind of like the final emergence of bourgeois society out of feudalism, that in the master slave dialectic, the slave discovers labor as like a source of freedom, and like a means for developing beyond the master. Uh, and so that's kind of like yeah, that would be the sort of understanding of what bourgeois society is. I mean, capitalism would be understood for Adorno as the kind of crisis or breakdown of that dialectic, the breakdown of labor, or the crisis of labor as the mediating value in society. Um, and then that's for because labor is in crisis, there is therefore also a crisis of art, um, because art would have Adorno would have understood like the kind of speculative quality of art in bourgeois society, that kind of like producing for the market and discovering art through that. Um, that there's in the breakdown of labor, like in the yeah, overproduction of labor that happens in capitalism, there's a kind of inability to adjudicate um, these things that are produced. Uh, I mean, the way that Adorno will talk about it in this introduction is that there's like new needs that artworks express, or that they kind of pick up on. They're like needs that are there in society, but that for whatever reason can't find their fulfillment. Um, and yeah, for Adorno, like that's the way that there is like a close, or there's a direct relationship between like art and the commodity form, or art and capitalism. And so while I think like from a Marxist perspective, there isn't a way for art to be done correctly. There's not like, it doesn't have prescriptions to give to art in terms of like what it should be or what it should look like, or you know, yeah. Rather yeah, Marxism has an understanding of history and how we've arrived at, the historical situation of the present, and how artworks reflect that, or a part of that, are bound up in that same kind of totalizing process. Um, yeah, it's interesting, and I mean it's tricky, because I think it means that I think and I think Adorno kind of like struggles with this throughout aesthetic theory. I think that's one of the things that makes aesthetic theory such a difficult read, is that the Marxism in it is so kind of buried and sublimated. Um,
Yeah,
you
Marx is not mentioned except in a sort of, or it's mentioned as sort of Sovietized,
mhm,
Stalinized Marxism in this. But the section, I think it's called Situation,
mhm,
that's like one of the more finished sections of aesthetic theory. And that is where he really develops the idea of the commodity as the basis for the autonomy of art, that
mhm,
art is free and it is art for art's sake is on the basis of it being a commodity.
Hmm.
That's where you can get your Marxism.
Yeah.
Where do you want to go next in
Um,
the text?
well, I was thinking just related to that, like, I mean, I was maybe gonna bring up Hegel a little bit too in there,
Hmm.
because I think that's one of the sort of other important parts. So like Hegel in the 19th century had this notion of art having become philosophical. And this was sort of the way that he was dealing basically with the Romantics, with Goethe and Schiller in particular, and the way that they were thinking about or reflecting on art and what it could be and should be. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think for Hegel, there's a sense that like um, how do I talk? I mean, yeah, we talked a
Art
little bit about like
becoming philosophical means art requires philosophy to complete
right,
itself. It requires reflection.
but also that art, it also means that art is no longer really art. I mean,
Hmm.
that's the kind of tricky part about it. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of like this emergence of, or yeah, Adorno taking up art as like what it has become through history, art as something that has emerged as like a product of history. And so there's a sense that like if you were to take like the history of art from like the cavemen to like the Renaissance, that would kind of be like the prehistory of art, you could say. It is like the history of art that created art. That is like what made art. And then in
What
the
became
Renaissance,
art retroactively.
right, in the Renaissance is when you have like people looking back on that entire history and being like, okay, what is this practice that we've developed, and how do we kind of like formalize that and kind of like, yeah, start thinking about what it means. I mean, that's when you get like Vasari as the first like art historian and like looking at the lives of all of the great artists and kind of trying to make sense of like, yeah, what they, well, yeah, what they mean, but also like what is the significance of like the fact that all of these artists, yeah, have come into existence and are doing these things and you know yeah, transforming our ability to imitate and reflect on the world. Um, and so yeah, with Hegel and yeah, with, I mean, yeah, then you have like a kind of further development of art, or formalization of art, I guess you could say, from the period of from the Renaissance into the 18th century, where you have like, if like the period from like cavemen to the Renaissance is like kind of like the unconscious development of art, you kind of have like the conscious development of art happening between the Renaissance and the 18th century. And then with the Romantics, you then have like a kind of the beginning of self-consciousness, because they're kind of really trying to think about like what does it mean to make art consciously, and what are the kind of um, models for that, and not just what are the models that are available to us, but like what would be desirable to get out of art. Um, and yeah, that's when art sort of becomes philosophical. But for Hegel, it's also like the yeah, potentially the end of art or the death of art. That there is this kind of like strange transformation that is kind of contained in that move to reflect on art. And that it seems that like, yeah, that self-consciousness would actually fundamentally transform what art is, or rather what art was, and would turn it into something new. And that's kind of like where the 19th century really begins. And that's why you have like Baudelaire in the middle of the 19th century really like thinking about the problem of modern beauty. And it's something that Adorno actually takes up in this introduction, where he's dealing with the relationship between the internal and the transitory. Because Baudelaire in the Salon of 1846 will talk about the need for um the need for artists to try to identify and make use of the forms of modern beauty. He talks about like the cut of like all black suits, and trying to like kind of finding an aesthetic sensibility in those kind of like in the kind of like minutia of modernity or something, and like in the way that it is different from everything that came before it. And with Baudelaire, there's almost kind of like a reversal in a sense, because he does like have this idea. He does have an idea of like eternal beauty, or rather of like a yeah, that there is like a kind of trans-historical beauty. But for him, for Baudelaire, that trans-historical beauty is something that emerges or that develops over time. And so that like for him, it's like every age has its kind of contribution to make to that trans-historical eternal beauty. That every age discovers something new or different that it finds beautiful, and then that kind of like transitory, ephemeral beauty, um, or what appears to be transitory, ephemeral beauty, actually becomes a part of this kind of like transhistorical beauty. And Adorno similarly has this kind of like reversal at a certain point where he's like, yeah, what matters is or like that there's an objective necessity to like the contemporary concerns of art that actually kind of supersedes these kind of like eternal questions or something. Um, so yeah, um, yeah. So Baudelaire has this sense of like modernity as allowing for a particular kind of like experience of the past as being past, um, and therefore open to transformation.
The Baudelaire quote, the modern artist makes it his business to extract from fashion whatever element it may contain of poetry within history, to distill the eternal from the transitory.
Yeah.
Where is Baudelaire figuring into the introduction?
Um, I mean, yeah, he comes up. I mean, I think it's again that there's like I mean, it's this thing that Adorno sort of repeats throughout the introduction, that like what seems to matter most about artworks is like what escapes. I mean, yeah, I mean, he sort of literally says it, what needs to be understood is the incomprehensibility of artworks. So it's like, yeah, the way that I mean, yeah, I mean, I think what Adorno would say is that like what is most important about artworks is the way that they leave us unsatisfied, um, or the way that they are kind of incomplete in a certain sense. That they push towards something that they themselves are not, and that's what's valuable about them. Because he says at one point that like if an artwork could just sort of be um, reducible, or if the value of an artwork could just be adjudicated by like the subjective response it engenders, then it's really no different than like any other kind of culinary
And
pleasure.
eating, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That like the value of good food is that it's good when you eat it. But the value of an artwork isn't necessarily that. And he has these examples. It's like, yeah, Kafka. Um, you know, can you really say that like reading Kafka is pleasurable? What would I mean? And even if you did, what would that say about your notion of pleasure? Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it's
disinterested satisfaction, not selfish.
It's yeah, it's not, it's like what would it mean to say that like your taste aligns with like Kafka or something or Beckett, and that's like what you find to be to your taste. I think for Adorno, what's interesting about, or yeah, what's interesting and valuable about those artworks is that they like have a pull to them, even despite the fact that they seem intent on like contravening our taste, like that they seem to like want to
And
blend.
yeah, and being repulsive in
Yeah,
some way.
yeah, and that's like yeah, and they have a right to too, in a sense. Or like that's yeah, I guess another point that Adorno would make is that like the kind of like antagonistic character of modern artworks is because they mistrust they mistrust a situation in which there is no antagonism there. Um,
Mhm.
and that they seem to think, yeah, that I mean, the reason that artists make artworks with the intention not just of making what somebody else had made before is because that they think that there's something more to be done. That what Adorno will come out and say is that every new artwork is like a criticism of old works, of everything that came before it. Otherwise, why make the thing? Um, And so even if it's not like in the artist's intention necessarily to do that, that like yeah, the drive, the motivation, or the what in the artwork demands it to be made, its creation, that's like what goes beyond every artwork that existed previously in some way, and maybe it's only in a very kind of like minor way or in a kind of very oblique way or something like that, but the intention is there, like that is the kind of like um spiritual content so to speak of an artwork. It's yeah, the way that it's unsatisfied with what exists, and tries to sort of go beyond it, um and yet at the same time using what exists to do that. uh,
I will relay a couple of questions from the chat on YouTube. James Joseph says, can aesthetics be something more than a visual experience? Can it be a feeling slash supportive force? Is it productive to continue to look at art as just an object rather than an active subject?
Okay. Well, I think okay, this is actually sort of going straight into the next point that I kind of wanted to make. Yeah. I mean, I think for Adorno, like subject and object can be a little bit tricky. Because yeah, for Adorno, they're dialectical categories, and so for him, they're always kind of interpenetrated, but each one always sort of implies the other, or like has the other within it already. And so, like, to think about artworks as like objective things isn't to say that they are not subjective, or rather, it's not like to kind of like separate out the subjectivity from the objectivity, but to try to understand like the objectivity of artworks as like previously objectified subjectivity, if that makes sense. Or like, the way that Adorno will kind of like break this down is that like everything that goes into like forming an artwork has already been preformed in some way by society. And so, it's not just like the genres, that like artworks kind of fit into, but it's even like, it's the colors, it's the structure, it's the form, it's the plot, it's the content, it's like the things that are depicted in it, it's the way that they're depicted, it's the techniques that are used to depict it, it's like, yeah, the pigments themselves that artists use on the canvas. It's like, all of these things are not like uh the art, like an artist like making an artwork doesn't approach these things from like a kind of pure position, right? These are things that they're kind of like inheriting. And so they kind of have already like a preformed character that is both subjective and objective. Um, it's a kind of like congealed subjectivity or like an objectified subjectivity, we could say. Um, I mean, and I guess, yeah, maybe to get a little even deeper into this, I think like for Adorno, like the categories of like subject and object aren't necessarily, about individuals. It's about society, and it's about like society as a whole, as being both subject and object. Because Adorno is not necessarily concerned with individuals having a really, I don't know. He's not like trying to train individuals to be really good at like looking at art or something like that. What he's concerned with is like understanding the social situation of art in the middle of the 20th century, and like what that says about history and how, you know, it poses a problem, that shows, yeah, that reveals something about the unfinished character of history. Um, so I think yeah, it's difficult because I think for Adorno, like the only thing that would really change the situation in a positive way is something that is outside of art entirely. And so I think for Adorno, like the only thing that would really transform everything that he's talking about is something like socialist revolution. But for him, that's not something that will happen through art, or that art really has anything to do with, other than like um, being bound up in the same problem of society or something. Um, and so, yeah, I think like, you know, the, for Adorno, it's like individuals' responses to art are less important than what the existence of the artwork says about, subjectivity as a kind of more general phenomenon. And so I think, the subjectivity that he would be concerned with isn't like an individual subjectivity, but like the subjectivity of society, um, as a whole. And so, yeah, that's why he's concerned with like, yeah, not really getting into artist's intentions. He's not, he doesn't want to approach art psychologically. He's not approaching art in terms of the viewers. He's not approaching art in terms of like, yeah, a response from the viewers to the artwork. He wants to think about like what is an artwork like as its own construction. If yeah, I mean, he the last in the very final section of the introduction, he quotes, or he makes reference to Goethe about like entering the artwork like a chapel, and that being the kind of model, um, for what he wants to think about. Which is not to say that there isn't something to be learned from these other ways of approaching art. Um, but I think for Adorno, like to approach art psychologically, or in terms of like a viewer response, would be to actually to your object would actually be something else. For him, that would be like sociology, and that's something that he did also do. um, yeah, and so you've got like his whatever, the stars down to earth, where he like writes about uh subjective responses to like astrology columns in Los Angeles, and I don't know, all of these different things. And so yeah, he does have that kind of he does have a sense of like approaching things that way as well. But I think, yeah, for him, that would be like the object would be something different, actually. And for aesthetics, the object of aesthetics should be uh, art, or art as such.
I want to ask about criticism and truth content. I want to read a passage. This is on page 341, about the need for aesthetics. Above all, however, aesthetics is demanded by the development of artworks. If they are not timelessly self-same, but rather become what they are because their own meaning is a process of becoming, they summon forth forms of spirit, commentary, and critique, for example, through which this process is fulfilled. These forms remain weak, however, so long as they do not reach the truth content of the works. They only become capable of this by being honed to aesthetics. The truth content of an artwork requires philosophy. It is only in this truth content that philosophy converges with art or extinguishes itself in it. The way toward this is defined by the reflected immanence of works, not by the external application of philosophemes. The truth content of works must be rigorously distinguished from all philosophy that is pumped into them by authors or theorists. The difference between the two, it must be suspected, has for close to 200 years been unbridgeable. What is the truth content? What is he talking about there?
Yeah.
What
Oh, well,
what
there's
is
like,
the task of criticism?
uh, there's something I wanted to bring up earlier, maybe, which is a good response to this. I mean, it's from the very beginning of negative dialectics, where he, is talking about philosophy, and he writes, philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. And yeah, to me, that would be sort of the same judgment on art, that art lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. And he actually kind of starts off aesthetic theory with the same kind of thought figure, talking about 1910 and circa 1910 as the kind of being the moment where the possibility of realizing art was missed. And so, he identifies like, yeah, the opportunity, chance, attempt at a socialist revolution in the beginning of the 20th century as being like the opportunity for realizing art that was missed, and that, art after that, art in the 20th century, um, the truth content that it has is that, yeah, the revolution failed. That's its meaning, or that's its kind of truth content. I mean, elsewhere he talks about this as like um, yeah, I mean, like the meaning of art's meaninglessness. Um, and not just like, I mean, I was thinking about this earlier, that it's like meaninglessness, not just as like a kind of like absurdity, um, but it's like meaninglessness in the sense that like the things that are supposed to be like carrying meaning no longer add up, or something like that. That it's like the meaninglessness for Adorno is more about like the way that there's a non-identity, that emerges between like content and form, or like content and meaning and understanding. I mean, he sort of like talks about these things in these different ways.
He talks about this in theater, comparing Sartre to Beckett. In
Mhm.
Sartre, in the play, it would be a very discursive sort of statement that nothing means anything or existence is absurd and futile. It would be very like explicitly stated. And
Mhm.
in Beckett, the plays, there's sort of efforts to establish coherence and sort of commensurability at this level of meaning, but then they just don't cohere, they fall flat. They they're sort of it's felt rather than stated, which is what also I think gets at the truth content is it's not kind of that every single artwork is telling you the exact same thing, like revolution failed, like that sucks, we're stuff, but they are all sort of making you feel in a different way as the sense of constrained potential, missed like something that's not being done, basically.
Mhm.
And that is not as specific or prescriptive as as it is in certain types of art.
Yeah. Um, yeah. There's also like the like a I don't know, like a breakdown in the relationship of the parts within the whole. I feel like that, he's also sort of talking about um, in that it seems like, yeah, there does seem to be like a kind of I don't know, separation of like form and content that happens in the work. Um, that at the same time is like, but yeah, it's like it appears, but at the same time, it's like not, it's a, um, yeah, it's like not really happening. But yeah, there's this kind of like breakdown of the relationship of the parts, but they're still kind of like being held together because otherwise, like the artwork wouldn't exist at all. And so there is this kind of like paradoxical relationship that art kind of um, develops, with regards to its own uh, means, I guess. And so it's like art is constantly trying to like escape from underneath the categories that it feels like are blocking like the recognition of what could be, um, and yet it without those like categories it wouldn't exist at all. And so I think Adorno deals with this in Beckett in terms of like the position of the narrator and the kind of like fraughtness it has in Beckett, where it's like he's actively kind of trying to question the possibility of narration at all, but he can only do that through like the narration of his characters. And so yeah, there's this kind of like I mean, yeah, and but I mean, the way that Beckett resolves it is like, I can't go on, I'll go on. There's this kind of like, I don't know, like, what would you say? Hmm. I mean, it's like machinery that like is broken down or something, but like kind of trying to keep um, I don't know, to make the like broken downness of the machinery, uh, like explicit. You kind of like got to keep running it or something like that. Um, I don't know. I mean, there's a relationship here. I mean, I'm trying to get at like the commodity form and like use value a little bit. I mean, I watched the other weekend Fellini's La Strada, which is maybe my favorite film of all time. But yeah, I mean, Giulietta Messina's character, Gelsomina, who's like this, I don't know, would you call her? I mean, she's a, I mean, she is a woman sold to a traveling circus performer who has no real skills and uh yeah, just kind of becomes attached to it. But I don't know. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit far from what I wanted to get to, but I got the sense like watching the film that like what it's about is like commodities that no longer have a use, who have sort of outlived their usefulness and kind of like their continued existence posing uh yeah, posing the question of like a use beyond their usefulness. Um and I think that's like basically the position that art sort of takes up with regard to itself in the 20th century, or at least that modernist art does. Um, that it's trying to sort of understand how all of these kind of um, forms of understanding and dealing with the world, this whole practice of art that seems to have yeah, it seems to have its origins at the beginning of like human civilization. Um, how all of those forms seem to have like come to grief and like no longer seem adequate. Um, I think that's really the question that, yeah, artists in the 20th century ask themselves. I mean, Barnett Newman sort of has this little quote that I read recently where he's like that, yeah, where he says something along the lines that they were trying to think about in the 40s and the 50s, like what it would be like to paint is as if you didn't know any anything about the history of painting prior. Um, and that's a kind of position that can only be motivated by knowing very well the history of all painting prior. And there's this kind of like paradoxical relationship, that you have to kind of like it's like out of the closeness of understanding, it's like out of a real like affinity to the thing that you're able to kind of try to go beyond it. And that's really, yeah, what Adorno is trying to lay out. And, not only that artists in the 20th century are doing that, but that then at a kind of like further level, for the critic, that's also their task with regards to like the 20th century or to these artists. Um, yeah, that there needs to be a kind of reflection on why art seems to be obsessed with its own death in modernity, um, and what that might mean. I think for Adorno, like um, the kind of goal, the telos of all of this is not like necessarily, um, it's not necessarily a new Renaissance, or like that's not necessarily what he's aiming at. Um, I don't think yeah, I think for him it's more that art seems to be posing the possibility of something beyond art, and yet it's unable to like do anything about it. And that I think for him is the real, question problem. Like, what does it mean that art no longer wants to be art? Um, yeah.
Where does that leave us?
Where does that leave us? I don't know. I mean, I mean, I think we're in this. I mean, I think for us, we have to at least reattain Adorno's consciousness of things. And I think, we've fallen below that. And so, yeah, for me, this lecture was sort of an attempt, to try to crawl back a little bit of a remedial education. But, there's a lot to get back to. I think we've only really regressed from Adorno's standpoint, and I think it's not. I mean, it's understandable. I think the what Adorno is advocating for is like balancing on a precipice. Um, and I think it's difficult to sustain. Um, because I think it involves like yeah, I mean, it involves having like an absolute commitment to art while at the same time, uh, not being willing to yeah, admit anything about it, I guess, or not willing to kind of like concede yeah, the kind of common sense around art, I guess, um, which is which does sort of tend to like reduce art to a question of like pleasure or ethics or um, you know, yeah. I feel like all of the ways that people sort of tend to respond to art in the present are just kind of subjective and individual. Um, and so really what's been neglected is the objective question of art and you know whether it has a right to exist, as Adorno puts it in the very beginning of aesthetic theory. I think that's like a question that was like on the top of people's minds in the 20th century in a way that like has been totally forgotten about now. Where I think, you know, now art is very much assumed, or like the value of art, the reason for art to exist, its right to exist is assumed by everybody. Um, and that's maybe uh yeah, maybe that's a problem.
You're referring to the first line of Art, Society, and Aesthetics, not the draft introduction where he says it is self-evident that nothing concerning art is self-evident anymore. Not its inner life, not its relation to the world, not even its right to exist.
Yeah, I mean, the art market didn't really was only just beginning, or at least the contemporary art market that we see today was just in its infancy when Adorno was writing aesthetic theory. So um, I think, yeah, that's what sort of replaced art's right to exist, or what seems to have confirmed right's art to exist since then, is that, art found a market. Um, but
It's an investment.
yeah, but maybe now there's a now that the market seems to be retracting, maybe there's an opportunity to reconsider the obsolescence of art and the simultaneous necessity. Art must go on, but it can't go on.
Do you think aesthetic theory has more to say to artists or critics?
Um, I mean, aesthetic theory isn't going to help you make an artwork, but at the same time, it's not really going to help you write about an artwork either necessarily. I think its value is in um, establishing a standpoint, maybe, or like a way of approaching things, a context, I guess, through which to approach things. And um, I don't know, maybe also more sort of, or yeah, um, I feel like it's also about like, um, what would you call it? I mean, it's the way that people get hung up on these like one-sided aspects of art. So I feel like it kind of can help you understand what like the fullness of experiencing art might uh entail. Not what it would look like necessarily, but I feel like it's yeah. Uh, I mean it's yeah. It's complicated. I mean it's one of those things where it's like every part of the book feels like it can like tessellate out into every other part. And at the same time that, like the argument that Adorno is making in aesthetic theory is kind of like inseparable from like the argument that he makes in the dialectic of enlightenment or in negative dialectics, and his kind of the kind of broader project of the Frankfurt School and of Marxism generally. Um, and so that's the way that I think it can be like yeah, that's the way that it's not maybe like a practically useful in a direct way, um, but nevertheless gives you a sense of the historical situation and where we find ourselves in the present and um, what it would take to even just like rise up to the challenge of meeting the present where it is. I guess, yeah, that's maybe what's sort of essential about it, or what I think is most essential about it is that it really gives you like a sense of the full depth of the problem of art in the present, and it doesn't hold back, and it doesn't offer any easy way outs. It doesn't even attempt to. There's no solutions. It's just one giant question mark. But it's kind of uh, the most worked out question mark that there is. And so, I think it's yeah, it's what would be minimally necessary for like having an understanding of art today that, for yeah, if one is really concerned with like accomplishing something historically within art, like this is the kind of uh the minimum that needs to be accomplished. And that's the difficulty of it.
There you have it, folks. A giant question mark. This is it. It does anyone have any more comments or questions? We're almost at an hour. We're above an hour, almost at an hour and a half. Uh, if not, this will be archived on YouTube for you to watch again. You can comment. Maybe we'll transcribe it. Any other closing remarks, Patrick?
Um, Nothing at the moment.
I
We'll probably try to
mean, that was a good last
yeah, I thought so too. No, I'm glad we got somewhere. I felt like this was a lot for me to take on. This was a very I took it on, not thinking it would be quite as much as it ended up being. I mean, but yeah.
Reading it is enough of a challenge, let alone turning around trying to
Well, reading it makes it seem
explain
like,
it.
yeah, reading it makes it seem like there's just, I mean, there's so much to explain or to talk about within the text that it makes it seem like it would be easy to kind of lay it all out. But then as you get into it, there's just I mean, it's the way that like the argument is such like a spiral. And so you're constantly
Mhm.
returning to the same points again and again, but in a different kind of formulation. And there's really no beginning or end to the argument. It's just like a spiral. And so, trying to figure out how to like present that or even begin to present that was a real challenge. But I struggled at the beginning. I'm glad we got out. I'm glad we got through to something. Um,
You
and
had some good spirals too yourself.
I will try to take some of this all and distill it once again into something maybe written.
Well, thank you. We will have a couple other lectures the rest of the fall. Hopefully one next month from Gabriel Almeida. And I intend to speak about a book I'm translating by Andre Breton in December. So thank you everyone for attending. Have a good night.
Thank you.